And I think just the recommendation as well that when you get, obviously, agreements to vary and new offers, you'll get the part that's changed, but making sure you've got the whole history so you can look back through to really properly see what has changed and what you're really committing to, not just the little bit that's changed in isolation, because if you don't pair the two together, you don't necessarily know exactly what you're signing up to.
Hello and welcome to the Connectology podcast. Here, Road Night Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk. Welcome everybody. This is very exciting because we've actually got some cameras in here. So there might be some film going out at some point on LinkedIn of this. So joining me today, I've got three of the, what numbers now, 5 connectologists, which is very exciting. So we've got, first of all, our most recent joiner of the team, Kyle Murchie. Say hello.
Hello, everyone.
Catherine Cleary.
Hi, Hugh.
Pete Aston.
Hello.
Great. And I'm Hugh Taylor. I'm CEO here and I'm only nominally in charge. So we are talking today, and I've got a working title, we always have a working title, of upcoming agreements to vary and mod apps. And I had originally thought that we were talking about mod apps, and I'm not entirely sure what agreements to vary are. So could one of you just talk about the title?
Can I tell you about what a mod app is and an agreement to vary? And I'll leave all the really complicated bits to Catherine and Kyle.
Good tactics there, Pete.
I'm jumping in quickly. So both a mod app and agreement to vary is where you get a different offer from the National Grid ESO. So we're talking about transmission schemes particularly here, although it could refer, I guess, to sort of project progressions from the DNO as well. But if we sort of just think about it just in sort of transmission terms first. So a mod app is where a developer's specifically requested a different offer to change something about their connection. So they might have changed the connection timescale, the capacity, potentially the technology. So something has changed and they specifically then need to get a new offer back from National Grid. An agreement to vary is where it's the other way around. National Grid is changing something and they need to issue a revised offer to accommodate whatever it is that they're changing. And the two main differences are, if it's a mod app, you pay for it as a developer. If it's an agreement to vary, you don't pay for it. National Grid covers the cost.
Well, or you pay for it in your kind of scheme costs. So National Grid kind of tally that up against money spent against your scheme, but you don't get an invoice.
Yeah. So it feels like you're not paying for it, but you probably are.
So here's a really important question. Why are we talking about this?
So lots of people are about to get issued an agreement to vary. There are a couple of reasons why. There are 3 things going on at the moment. We've got the kind of end of the 2-step offer process. So there are a whole load of people who are about to get, not technically an agreement to vary, but a step 2 offer. So they've had their kind of step 1 offer, which was kind of indicative, and they're about in February, by the end of February, to receive from the ESO their step 2 offer, which will basically be a kind of variation of the existing thing they've signed with a few more details in it. So that's one class of customers who are about to get a kind of update on their offer. The next people are people who were contracted, they accepted their transmission connection, and they put their hand up in the expression of interest last year to ask for their connection to be accelerated. So these might have been battery connections or other connections that were ready to build. And they are about to get, and the first customers have already got one, but the ESO is kind of issuing this out in tranches. So the second group of customers who are about to get a variation to their accepted offers are people who expressed interest, so submitted an expression of interest last year to ask for their connection to be accelerated. So NGESO has just started writing out to those people with agreements to vary. So again, where that's coming from NGESO with your accelerated connection date and changes to that. And the third group of people are all of the contracted transmission customers who are going to have milestones added into their offers. So that's probably the third tranche of agreements to vary that we're going to see later this year. So they should start coming out after May.
I suppose just in addition to that, you've then got the usual reasons for why a project might want to vary. And particularly as projects move further on in their development cycle, additional information comes forward, technical changes, for example, which might have an impact on fault level in feeds. It might be to change particular specifications of the generator itself. It might be traditionally it would be maybe to move your date slightly. Once you're starting to get a feel for when your actual completion date will be. So there's still all that going on.
The business as usual.
The business as usual, absolutely. In addition to all these other changes as well. And I think the complication there is you've got multiple different reasons why a project might want to mod app or is ultimately receiving one. And you've got to try and layer them on top of one another to try and make sure you're getting ultimately what you need and want out of that change.
So what do people need to know about agreements to vary and mod apps? That's too much. Should we start with where the risks are? Where are the bear traps?
Can I just add a different one in before someone else answers that question about risks and bear traps? It's just that it's just like an administration point, really. But with the ESO having to do all these mod apps and agreements to vary, they are super busy at the moment. That they are absolutely run ragged. So actually getting anything out of the ESO at the moment is quite challenging on a site specific basis. That isn't to do with them getting out mod apps and agreement to vary. So that was it's a minor point, but it's it's an
important one. Be nice to your CAM. When they email out this agreement to vary, it's one of about 700 they've had to do. There's a huge amount of work.
So we feel for them.
Yes,
absolutely.
definitely.
Feel for them. Yeah, good. So bear traps.
Things to be looking at. So obviously, this is quite. It's particularly important when you get issued an agreement to vary. So you haven't requested a mod app or a mod offer. So this is kind of coming out from NGESO. So you need to know why is that agreement to vary being offered to you? Is it because you expressed interest in being accelerated, in which case you can expect that agreement to vary to have an accelerated date? With that accelerated date comes some accelerated obligations for you. So things like your securities will change to meet that new date. So potentially you've got higher liabilities earlier on in the project. You're also going to have milestones associated with that earlier date. So you are potentially, by signing that agreement to vary, you are committing to some really quite important project stuff. Effectively, these milestones, if you don't meet them, you will be terminated. So there are some really quite significant pain points for developers who've put their hand up and said, I'd like an earlier date. With that earlier date comes the responsibility to be able to build earlier. And that's both sort of financial liability and in terms of risk of you losing your offer if you don't meet your milestones.
Anyone got a bigger risk?
I just think on that, it's just very careful for developers to look super carefully at the offer that comes out and not just think this must be fine and just accept it. Because obviously once you've accepted it, you're contractually bound by it. But you can choose to not accept the mod offer or an agreement to vary. So there can be circumstances in which you've got an offer in front of you, you've done the assessment and you go, no, I'm not going to proceed. I'm happy with my later connection date because I can't meet those earlier milestones or whatever. So there's very much a decision point.
A kind of a go or no go decision point. Yeah.
Is there any opportunity for pushing back on anything on these offers?
So there are probably going to be a reasonable number of people who are in a position where last year they perhaps expressed interest in having an earlier connection date. They've now got an agreement to vary, or they're about to get an agreement to vary, which perhaps offers them that earlier connection date. And as I say, with that comes the responsibility to be able to meet your milestones and your securities. The other point is that the earlier connection date you're being given is on the basis normally of non-firm transmission access. So you're expecting to now be constrained. When you put your hand up and said, I'd like an earlier connection date, you didn't necessarily know what that constraint risk was going to be. The ESO obviously asked people to kind of indicate what kind of constraint risk they'd be prepared to tolerate. So actually, one of the key things is going to be saying, okay, this offer is on the table to accelerate my connection. Is it worth it commercially? If I'm being offered an acceleration of maybe 2-3 years, but I've got a curtailment risk, which I now think is really significant, maybe you don't want to build that project earlier. So it's really worth thinking about whether it's, does that curtailment risk outweigh the benefit of getting onto the system earlier? And so there's some curtailment data, which is going to be provided, but it's not as straightforward as a sort of DNO curtailment assessment where it just says, you've got an 8% curtailment risk. It's the technical sort of outage conditions are being provided and some historic data regarding those outages and a projection of how likely those outages, which might cause overloads, are to occur in the future. So you've got a few different bits of data which will need analysis before you can decide whether it's a good idea to accept.
And we're just starting to see some of these trickle through already, aren't we? So we're just starting to build up a picture of what the ESO are doing and what this curtailment information looks like. I think one of the ones we've seen so far looked a little sparse or a little odd.
Yeah, perhaps didn't. So that to give people a kind of nuance there, that particular offer kind of outlined some conditions, so some outage conditions on the transmission network under which the TO thought there would be overloads, but it also said that there could be overloads and therefore the site could be constrained down under kind of normal running conditions, so an intact system. And obviously, we don't have any outage data associated with that because the intact system happens all the time. So actually, there's kind of potentially more information that might need to be provided if that's the case than the ESO have previously kind of committed to providing. So I think there might be a bit of ongoing discussion to make sure customers really can bottom out their constraint risk before they accept these. Because, that customer is making a significant commitment in return to the ESO, saying, yes, I'm happy to take these higher securities, these earlier milestones. And they want to be doing that on the certainty that they've got a bankable project.
That's really key because before you could make changes more easily. So particularly with the milestones being in place now, and as you say, with securities potentially now being increased and your trigger date now moving forward towards you, it will become much more difficult potentially in the future if you wanted to make some further changes, whether that was to date, whether to technology, etc. So the decision now is quite different to maybe how it would have been if you'd received something like this a year or so ago. So that methodology that developers traditionally have isn't necessarily the right one to progress with now.
And it's important to say most of these are going to have still the sort of 3-month acceptance windows associated with them, aren't they? So there is going to be time for developers to make some sort of assessment of the information. So it's not like you've just got 2 weeks to think about it and turn it around.
Yeah, and this probably goes back to when you're making that assessment. Obviously, we've sort of talked about this as being a bit of a go, no-go decision point. But it's probably worth us coming back to the reason that you got this agreement to vary, and there being a couple of different reasons that you might have got an agreement to vary. If you are one of these customers that asked for earlier non-firm access through that expression of interest, as Pete's quite rightly said, you could choose to not accept that agreement to vary. You can say, thanks, but actually I've looked at my timeframes and you know what, I don't want to accelerate the project. I haven't got planning yet. It's too risky. I'm not sure I can meet my milestones, so I'm not going to accept this agreement to vary. You can make that decision. The agreement to vary will simply lapse. And what will happen is you will in due course, in the second half of this year, get a new agreement to vary, which just adds milestones in. So no longer on an accelerated basis based on your previously contracted date. The other type of customers, so who didn't express interest in being accelerated, the people who are just getting agreements to vary, as I say, that's going to be kind of the last tranche of customers. So later on this year, getting agreements to vary purely to add milestones in. Now, technically speaking, you could not accept that agreement to vary. But in practice, if you don't accept that agreement to vary, the ESO will simply say, you haven't met your construction sort of program to date, or you're not showing us sufficient, sort of credible development opportunities to do so. And so they will then start to take other steps, to either terminate that agreement or to change your connection date. So you do need to be aware that you have a user choice about accelerating a connection date. When it comes to milestones being added into your offer, there's no user choice really. You're going to get milestones, or you're going to be kind of effectively pushed right to the back of the queue.
Just on the milestones point, so just going to flag Kyle's calculator that we've got on the website. So for calculating your milestones, and we've also done a podcast on milestones the other day. I think we have. I'll put links in the description to those things.
This feels like a good time to take a break. Should we take a break?
Sounds good.
I hope you're really enjoying this episode so far and are gaining a lot of very useful insight. If you're a new listener, I hope that you'll feel like you might come back. If so, make sure you hit the follow button and feel free to sign up to our newsletter, The Connectologist, at roadnighttaylor.co.uk so you don't miss out on any of the podcast webinars, case studies, thought pieces and explainers. Right, welcome back everybody.
We've also been talking a lot about that curtailment risk and assessing curtailment risk, which obviously isn't easy. So I'll put a link in the description because I think we've done some curtailment risk podcasts and webinars, and outage risk as well, which is maybe not quite so relevant. But we'll put links in to all of those anyway.
That milestone calculator is a really good tool, actually. I mean, I'm just saying that, but it's Kyle's tool, so I'm being very. It's not just blowing up my own trumpet, but that is really useful. Obviously, the ESO kind of haven't got something on their website at the moment which lets you directly do this for yourself. So if you're not sure what your milestones are going to be, so you haven't got that agreement to vary yet, as I said, they're not coming out unless you're one of these earlier accelerated projects. Those agreements to vary with people's milestones are not coming out until after May this year. So if you're sitting there thinking, oh, what's the bad news going to be? It's definitely worth having a look, because you can just plug in what your connection date is at the moment, your contracted completion date, and it's based off when you get that new agreement to vary. So we're probably saying to people, maybe, assume you might get that in, say, June, July this year. If you kind of put that date in as the agreement to vary date, then the milestone calculator will sort of work out when your milestones will be.
So the idea is that you'll know what to expect when that agreement to vary comes out.
So it's not a significant surprise. You should know what it looks like, and also you can do a bit of a sense check as well if you're looking to put additional mod apps in the future. You can get a feel for, well, depending on what date you put in or what date you receive that offer, what those milestones would look like.
Cool.
And I guess that kind of comes back. Probably the original title of this podcast was just mod apps and how to do them, what you need to think about. And I guess the reason for thinking about that is that you need to know what your milestones are likely to be in case you think you can't live with them. So if you think your milestones are going to kick in before you get planning, before you have land rights, you have a very limited window up until the 27th of May this year, 2024, to mod app. So that is absolutely critical. So anyone who is thinking, well, I've got a connection date, in the next 5-6 years, you are going to have milestones within the next couple of years. So you really need to look at whether or not they are achievable. If they're not achievable, you will lose that offer. You will be terminated. So this is a critical decision point.
And the risk of termination, just to be clear, I think I'm right in saying the risk of termination relative to a distribution project
it's far higher. So we're talking automatic termination of a construction agreement, and you get charged your securities. So so it's not just, sorry, we're going to have a conversation about whether or not you're progressing your project. This is in 60 days your contract will be terminated, and by the way, you owe us several £100,000, several £1 million. The financial penalty of terminating is going to be significant for a lot of people as well.
So with the milestones, you can still change your date. So you can move out your connection date through a mod app. But importantly, the milestones stay fixed.
Sure.
So even if you say, well, actually, I can't connect for another 2 years, you've still got to do all the planning piece, the land piece, all that needs to be done in line with whatever you've agreed.
Unless you submit your mod app in the next couple of months. So if you get that mod app in before May the 27th, then you will get your new connection date.
But that mod app is charged as well, though, isn't it?
It is,
if you do that.
And I suppose, and one of the kind of key points, I think, and Gesso have done a really good job at highlighting this on various webinars, but we should probably make it as well, is that if you are one of those customers that's thinking, I don't like the look of what I think my milestones are going to be, I'm going to submit a mod app to push my connection date back by a year, a couple of years, there is no guarantee that you will get that connection. If you're looking at a connection date that maybe is currently sort of sitting there 2027, you don't feel comfortable with those milestones, you maybe want to push it back to 2029, you need to be very aware that the ESO may come back and say, I'm sorry, actually, we're going to offer you 2034, 2036. You're not necessarily going to get the date you want. The queue has obviously moved on significantly since you made your original application. So people need to be really aware of that risk.
You could get sort of stuck in that limbo situation of, if you don't mod app, you can't meet your milestones. If you do mod app, your connection's so far out that it might not be viable for you. So
caught between the devil and the deep.
Yeah, there could be that risk.
I think there absolutely is that risk. And to be honest, I think that is kind of, it's perhaps inevitable in the sense that we've perhaps seen quite a lot of customers not progress transmission schemes as quickly as we would normally have expected, perhaps if we'd gone back sort of 4 or 5 years where there were a smaller volume of applications, those applications were less speculative. So I think, it is a risk that people have potentially incurred themselves by applying too soon and then not doing anything with those transmission offers.
It's when we're talking about putting a mod app in the next couple of months and trying to get that sorted out before the milestones come in. Am I right in saying it's not just getting the mod app in, it's getting a clock started?
No, I think you have. Sorry, yes, no, you're right. You have until May the 27th to get the clock started.
Clock started.
Which probably in practice means you need to get that application in by the beginning of April.
Yeah.
End of this week.
Because clock start
Based on recent
takes
experience.
quite a while, doesn't it?
Clock
the
start
moment.
has been taking a long time because of some of the administrative processes in the ESO in terms of invoicing customers.
But when
I suspect there will be a bit of an effort to try and
But
accelerate
if you're
that.
only doing a change to push your connection date back, there's nothing really technical there for them to sort of have a conversation with you about. So might be a bit easy for them to clock start it if it's just a date change.
As long as they can invoice you.
As long as they can invoice you.
And actually, I've got a question for Catherine. So, because I don't know the answer. So, in the case where you've gone through, submitted an expression of interest, and you're now getting an earlier connection date, would you also be liable for early use charges, early access charges?
So effectively, that earlier offer, the couple of ones we've seen so far, effectively move forward your energization date, so your ACL date. So you are essentially, we are now moving the entire kind of securities and liabilities process. So it's not a case of, there is a concept of essentially requesting access before your completion date in the contract, which is a slightly different process. So no, that those kind of slightly more detailed charges associated with a generator who's perhaps requesting early access for like auxiliary supplies on site, that's not the mechanism that the ESO are using here, that as far as we can see. It is much more simplistic. It is literally, you used to have a completion date, so your ACL date, your connection date of 2028, and now we are rewriting your construction agreement Appendix J, and you're going to have a completion date of 2026, say, and that then gets carried forwards into things like your S curve for your securities and liabilities and your MM statements.
I'm really curious actually as to whether Pete knew the answer to that.
No, not at all.
Good question.
So it's a good question. I've got another question for Catherine. This is like,
It's
yeah,
like
grill
sitting in the hot
Catherine.
seat, isn't it? Yeah.
With the sort of voluntary mod app to delay the connection dates in order to be able to meet milestones, is there a risk of incurring delay charges on your connection?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the answer is yes, because absolutely, if you do mod to delay a connection date, then you can incur delay charges. It's probably worth explaining to people. In practice, there's a couple of elements to a delay charge. There are actually two types of delay charge. People who are interested in the techie detail, it's all in the charging statements. So NGETs or the TO's charging statement. But in practice, it relates to a TO having delivered works earlier than they needed to. So this is something you need to worry about a lot if your connection date was coming up in the next few years and you know that the TO has started doing works and you're trying to push that back. Hopefully, not very many projects that are trying to push back their dates are in that position. More of them will be in the kind of pre-works having started because the project hasn't really been progressed. But I think in theory, you're right, that is a relevant concern.
It's probably more for those that are just like a couple of years away from connection, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
very few projects, right?
Contractually,
sure.
there are still a lot of projects sitting with dates in the next, 2 years. I mean, when the ESO did their original key management milestones, they analysed that to say, how many, because actually, if you have a connection date in the next 2 years, you were going to be exempt from milestones. But I think very sensibly, the ESO said you're exempt from milestones unless you don't appear to have been actively progressing your project to meet that connection date in 2 years' time, which they think is about 40 gigawatts worth of projects. I think roughly that number, 40, 50, somewhere in that region. Yeah. So actually, there are quite a few contracted parties who, in theory should have been, going into construction and are possibly still kind of just desktop projects.
And therefore, those that could potentially have delay charges applied. And actually, in a lot of cases, if you're making even minor changes quite late on, getting quite close to energization, there are going to be some form of delay charges. It's the magnitude that's going to be quite key. It is definitely something to have quite clearly on your risk register, and definitely would advise quite a bit of.
Is this a podcast topic for the future?
Delay charges, or maybe we should. It might be a bit of a niche one. I have to see if we get lots of customers coming to us and asking questions about delay charges.
Great. So, could I have from, I guess, all of you, a simple list of what is my checklist that should be hopefully giving me peace of mind when it comes to mod apps or agreements to vary?
I guess for any offer that you get back, there's a few things, so whether that's come as a result of you submitting a modification application, or whether it's just come as an agreement to vary direct from National Grid. I think the key one for me is probably looking at your new date and how that impacts your securities profile. So I would definitely be making sure that you have a new S-curve. And then I think the other thing for me is looking at that Appendix Q. So you'll have a brand new Appendix Q, which is going to be your milestones.
Yeah, and as part of the liabilities and that S-curve is then mapping that out and being able to see, right, exactly when is the trigger date. Because that's going to be really key, particularly for those projects that have moved forward. That trigger date could be much earlier than was initially anticipated.
And then I think you also need to be looking to make sure you've got all the adequate information around the curtailment. So yeah, have you got the historic outage data and so on? So yeah, just making sure that you've got everything you need to be able to do that analysis.
And should you expect that outage data in
yes? So that outage data should come from the ESO when you get your agreement to vary. If you're getting one of these agreements to vary, which gives you non-firm access.
So you check that you've got it and check that it looks plausible. Right?
Exactly, yeah. And whether you need to request anything further, as we said, that I think one of the ones we've seen so far, we do need to have a further conversation about data
with the ESO,
and the TO.
Cool.
And I think just the recommendation as well, that when you get, obviously, agreements to vary and new offers, you'll get the part that's changed, but making sure you've got the whole history so you can look back through to really properly see what has changed and what you're really committing to, not just the little bit that's changed in isolation. Because if you don't pair the two together, you don't necessarily know exactly what you're signing up to.
That is really important, actually. So on the front page of your agreement to vary, there is a useful bit of text which says, we are varying the following documents. And it will say things like your BCA, your construction agreement appendices. And then it will say things like, all of your other documents remain the same. And you'll think, which were those other documents? So actually, it's a kind of jigsaw puzzle to go back and look at what you were given originally, which will include BCA appendices. So like, your Appendix A, your AB, your Appendix C, things like that probably haven't changed because Appendix C just deals with your tech, probably hasn't changed. So actually you need to take all of the new bits you've been given and add in all of the old bits which haven't changed. And then you've got your complete set of what would be your contracted position if you sign.
And the old bits could be over several modifications in the past, depending on the duration of the project and how long it's been going for. So it could be that, you're already have, seen an offer where we were reviewing something that was on version F. So you're reviewing new documents for version F, but you've still got to try and get back to version A.
With these projects, there is so much at risk, and yet there's so much more complexity than I'd even dreamt of. And that's why.
It's the nature of transmission. These are big projects, people are trying to build. There's a huge amount of technical and commercial information in a connection agreement.
And the numbers are huge.
The numbers are huge, exactly. It's something that I think the vast majority of, of our listeners, I totally understand that, that actually, contracting a 500 megawatt project at transmission is no small task. And
all three of them know that.
Yeah, you think we've whittled down the audience in the process of this podcast. Anyone still listening probably knows this.
Great. So unless any of you got anything absolutely burning, then I think we'll call it a day. And so thank you three very much. Thank you everybody out there for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
Thanks you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you for taking your precious time to listen to this episode. Now, not everyone is ready to have a connectologist in their life. For others, it's just too expensive. And as our team is so small, we do have to be very selective in what work we take on. And that's why we put so much effort into these shows. We want our society to have the equitable energy system it needs in order to decarbonise and to thrive. So we want to help to topple as many connections barriers as we possibly can, in spite of our size. So please do feel free to ping a link to this episode to anyone you know who might be interested, because it would mean so much to everyone here.